Since the uprising after the death of Freddie Gray and the subsequent report from the Department of Justice on the Baltimore City Police Department outlining its use of racist and unconstitutional practices, The Real News has done in-depth analysis and reporting on policing and its consequences in Baltimore. One facet of that coverage has been the efforts to reform policing, which has encompassed a wide range of stories on activists, legislation, and the consent decree between the DOJ and the city. And it was this topic Towson University asked Real News reporters Taya and Stephen Janis to discuss with students who are studying the topic. Here are the highlights from this conversation.
Obviously, the title is meant to be provocative, and that's sort of intentional. I spent the past, probably 11 years of my career as a journalist covering policing and law enforcement in Baltimore, and it is the most defining government agency in Baltimore, and it is probably where Baltimore has put most of its resources in terms of social capital and actual money. And unfortunately, as you all probably know, it hasn't turned out very well for the city. As you may or may not know, we are having another record year of homicides. I think we're at about 303, 304. We passed 300 this weekend. This would be the third year in a row where I think the third year, right, that we passed 300.
Yes.
We had the death of Freddie Gray and the subsequent uprising. We had, and these are things we'll go into detail later, we had the Justice Department report, which found that the Baltimore City Police Department practiced unconstitutional and systemically racist strategies or tactics in the city. And we had the gun trace task force indictments where 8 officers have been indicted.
Well, 8 officers now.
Right.
It was originally 7 officers who were charged with racketeering, with theft, with actually stealing from members of the community, as well as filing bogus overtime. So it essentially, for example, one officer in particular filed for overtime saying that he was on the job, but he was actually down at Rehoboth Beach playing golf. So that's an example of some of the ways that they were stealing and taking from our community.
So the point being that, having been through this cycle many times, and we're at a very sort of fraught moment in the city to try to, in some ways, address crime and also fix a police department which most people agree is broken, we decided to take a different kind of tack in reporting about it, which was not to just sort of look at it through the litmus of the immediate, but put some contextual or historical, or try to look at policing in different ways. Because right now the city of Baltimore is facing the dilemma of probably having to spend $50 to $60 million in reforming policing, right? So this is on top of the fact that we already spend $500 million on policing. And this is on top of the fact that last year alone we had $50 million in overtime over, well, it was $40 million over budget. So the continued costs, the continued rise in crime, you would think would call for something radical. But nothing really radical has happened. We just approved a consent decree monitor who is part of, let me explain, from the Justice Department report, we entered a consent decree with the federal government. And we just entered in that agreement and picked a monitor, so to speak, who will be monitoring the police department and to make sure they're compliant with this particular agreement. However, that monitor will cost about $1.75 million a year. You add that on to pension costs, which are about $125 million a year, and you have a situation where the city is basically stuck. I mean, we're stuck. We spend more on policing year over year. We spend more on policing, we spend on schools, recreation and parks, and yet our crime is higher than ever. And in a way, the reason I approached it from this perspective was because I think that emphasis has not just to do with money and law enforcement, but a sort of cultural and social dominance of the conversation, to the point where I don't think we really understand what's going on in Baltimore. Now, Joyce may remember I was here, how many years ago when I did that was like 4 or 5 years ago. Yeah. And I talked about this in some fashion, but really no one paid attention at that time. It took the uprising and what happened with Freddie Gray to really get people to think about this. But clearly, all evidence aside, if policing is a solution to the problems in Baltimore, it has not worked. I think it's worthwhile to not look at policing just as a function or a part of governance, but to look at policing as a communal philosophy that has to be reconsidered. To try to understand, the point of our reporting was to try to get beyond this idea that we have a police department here that's perfect administrator of justice, and the city government here, and then wraparound services, and somehow all these things will coalesce towards a solution. But that has not turned out to be the case. And so the question is why? Why is it that policing continues on this path that doesn't seem to be helping itself or the community it's supposed to serve? And why do we constantly get embroiled in this debate that doesn't seem to move or change, really change?
Officers felt so above the law, so free to act with impunity and to take whatever they wanted from the community that even though the federal government was literally leaning over their shoulders, watching what our police department was doing, it didn't stop them in the least.
So I want to take people back a little bit just to explain how we got here and how we got with our story. So I started recovering policing in 2006 with the now defunct Baltimore Examiner. It was a newspaper that was started and stopped within 3 years. And I was the senior investigative reporter. And during that time, I kind of caught the tail end of a policy that was called zero tolerance.
Zero tolerance is based off of broken windows theory, which was a short essay written by two people that created the idea of a city or the city community as a building. And if there were broken windows, there were nuisance crimes. If you took care of the nuisance crimes, then the rest of the crime would follow. That if you had broken windows and
you fix the windows,
and you fix those windows, then you're going to fix the community.
Right.
Let me just add that with zero tolerance, just much like it is in school, it's one strike and you're out, and it's for very small crimes. So when I looked through about a year worth of police reports for 2006 and 7, and the arrests were for things like expectorating, which is fancy for spitting on a sidewalk, or having an open container of beer, or urinating in public. Very, very small crimes that people were being taken off the street and taken to jail for. And as you can imagine, flooding our criminal justice system with people for such small crimes put in really an undue burden on the entire judicial system, but it also really hurt these people. You can imagine spending 2 days in jail doesn't help you if you have a job where you're paid hourly. Can cause you to lose your job. There's certainly landlords now, even though it's illegal to do this, if your landlord finds out you've spent some time in jail, you can be evicted. Now, technically, they're not supposed to, but that kind of thing happens all the time. So zero tolerance really had a terrible impact on the community. And during the height of it, which I think was in 2009, there were around roughly 106,000 arrests. So in a city of 630,000 people, imagine 106,000 arrests. Now, of course, some of these were repeats, but that's an incredible number of Baltimore citizens to be arrested at any given time.
Yeah. So, and the reason I go back is sort of see how we got here. This policy was a big sort of turning point for the city because people have been arguing we need to go with community policing, and then Mayor Martin O'Malley said, no, we're going to arrest as many people as possible. But what really struck me about zero tolerance is I had been writing about it, kind of talking about stories about people getting arrested for all sorts of crazy stuff. And one day I got a call from a source of mine. I have sources in all the prisons because that's where everything happens, unfortunately, in Baltimore. And he called me and he said, "Stephen, you gotta come down here. You're not going to believe I'm staring at this kid." I'm like, "What do you mean?" He goes, "They just arrested a 7-year-old." I'm like, "What did they arrest a 7-year-old for?" He said, "I don't know. I have no idea, but come down here." So what it actually ended up happening, when I got down there, I sort of rushed around. I found them. I met the mother. We agreed to go back to her house. And I'm sitting there, and I'm like, why did they arrest your son? And she said, well, he was sitting on his mini electric bike, and police officer took it because dirt bikes are illegal, but it wasn't really a dirt bike.
Well, they're illegal in the city. They're not illegal.
But it wasn't a dirt bike. And so I called the sergeant to complain because it was my son's bike, and I wanted it back. So they showed up an hour later, and they arrested him for riding a dirt bike. And as I started to ask this child, who had just turned 7, he was 6, about the story, he started crying, and we took a picture, and it became this huge story. And because it was just hard for people to believe that the city would arrest a 7-year-old. But what really stunned me was the reaction that I got as a reporter from this particular case.
Well, for some people, it wasn't hard to for them to imagine arresting a 7-year-old, and the type of blowback he received was really shocking. People emailed him, contacted his newspaper, and said things like, that 7-year-old is an animal. He's a drug dealer in the making. He's a thug in the making. For reporting on it, Stephen was called, the nicest of the words was race traitor. So there was a lot of blowback saying that this young boy who just turned 7 years old was somehow already a criminal and already a thug.
Yeah, so that was the point in time when I started thinking differently about policing, because I couldn't really understand why we would arrest a 7-year-old for something. And I mean, I guess if you shot somebody, and what was amazing was the story was picked up by like 115 newspapers because people couldn't believe we did it. They couldn't. But there also was the argument, and this was after Freddie Gray, because after the officers were arrested, the argument that, and this is an interesting argument, that the reason crime went up was because police were no longer willing to do their job. They took a knee, which is an interesting thing to think about. Another thing to think about in this discussion of how we philosophize policing, that they said, basically, we're not going to enforce the law because you held us accountable. So even after the Justice Department report, there was very little change and that's when we sort of kind of started talking about, what are we missing from the story of policing? And of course, we're journalists, so being a journalist, you have certain limitations on how you can report things. I mean, you're not supposed to offer an opinion, and you're not supposed to interpolate certain kinds of things into your reporting. I mean, you're supposed to be pretty straightforward. But it felt like we weren't really getting some way to tell this story so people understood that there's something here more than just a discussion of law and order, or discussion of right and wrong, or all the things, all the rhetorical elements that comprise the discussion of policing didn't seem to be addressed with straightforward reporting of just, this is what happened and this is what didn't happen. I mean, no matter how many times, as Taya pointed out, that was a damning report. It was what, how many pages? It was like 100, 200 pages.
163 pages, I think.
Now, if we as journalists had a report about us like that, we would have been fired.
Absolutely.
But nothing happened to the police department. In fact, they got more money.
Right.
They got $40 million in overtime.
As a matter of fact, Mayor Pugh, who the consent decree and the independent monitor kind of fell into her lap. Initially, they were talking about, well, it might be $9 million we need to give the police department. Well, it might be, well, first it was 6, then it was 9, then it was 12,
10
and
per
then
year.
She said
10
it'll be as much as they need.
Right, so they're talking about another $50 million to increase training, to buy better equipment, and certainly some of these things are legitimate. But the question is, where does it end for this community? Where do we come? Why can't we get beyond this sort of rhetorical wall that all this money and everything is all going to be productively spent, or encourage productive outcomes, right? And that's what is at the heart of what we were talking about, and why we came up with the idea to do some stories that were a little bit off the traditional journalism. I guess what would be the sort of traditional journalism framework, right? And we can show you one of them right now. And what precipitated this specifically was body camera footage, which, as you know, body cameras. Well, go ahead, Tay. Sorry.
Well, no, I was just going to say we are finally having body cameras implemented in Baltimore City, which I think is a very positive thing. But you may have seen some clips of the footage that seem a bit strange. It seems as if police officers are either there's two ways to view it. You could say they are reenacting how they discovered evidence, or you could say they are planting evidence. It depends on what side of that you land on. But either way, it is interfering with the chain of custody. You're not supposed to reenact placing evidence. And so what's happened is, now that this body-worn camera footage has come to light, the city state's attorney's office, Marilyn Mosby's office, has had to throw out a ton of cases because you can't interfere with the chain of custody like that.
And it's caused a great amount of controversy because the police have been very defensive in saying their officers were just, they got drugs, and later on they were just simply staging. And but obviously the public defender and the defendants say no, they were planting evidence, which of course is pretty bad. But what struck me about the footage, and the reason I use it in these stories, is it also told another sort of narrative, which is in a city with hundreds of unsolved murders, why do we have police officers rummaging around the back of a row home in trash for 4 hours?
For 4 gel caps,
'Cause
which
you
is
have-
worth about $40.
Right. But this is a question. I mean, I want to pose this question. I think it's an important question. I mean, we have people being murdered every day, and yet this is our elite units. These are specialized units
Right.
that actually the one that came up after the Gun Trace Task Force. It's called the District Action Team. But they're elite narcotics units, and they spend their time rummaging around in the back of a row home going through trash. What would be the point of that? I guess for the first time seeing it, right? I mean, you see the hours that they're spending to get like 2 gel caps. And in fact, there's one case that was covered where they arrested this young man who had $5 cash. He ran and he dumped a little cigarillo pack, or what was it?
Yeah, like it's like a cigar pack.
Yeah, which
that's
could have had like
sort of like a little Ziploc
5 or
at the
6
top.
gel caps in it. And
at the
later
most.
on, they couldn't find it, so they tapped his phone. And when they tapped his phone, they sent out another 4 officers who then staged finding it. But think about that. I mean, do you know what that costs? To have 7 or 8 or 10 officers focused on this? To have people rummaging through? It just struck me as a total exercise in futility, and we weren't really understanding what it meant. I mean, the one thing we have to remember, one thing we should mention in all this discussion is the war on drugs, right? The war on drugs is a big part of that because it's a very specific type of criminality. The war on drugs gives a police officer the power to arrest somebody for being proximate to a substance, for being in possession. Not really a crime. It can be a crime of intent simply by volume, but when you think about it, if Taya was sitting here and there was more than 10 ounces of weed, she's a criminal. Well, not 10 ounces, 10 grams. 10 grams,
10
right, sorry.
Not,
right, 10 ounces.
If
Right.
10 ounces, I might be distributing.
Yeah, and just before they decriminalized marijuana, we did an analysis of marijuana arrests in Baltimore City for minor possession. There were 6,000 in, I think, 2014. And what do you think the racial breakdown on the marijuana arrests were? Anyone want to take a guess? So the point is that you have this instrument in criminal justice to arrest people for proximity to a substance. So it gives you the and from that you get grants and money, and it generates a lot of money, and you can go into backyards and rummage around for hours, because as long as you find something,
Right.
you have criminality.
Which makes the